They looked down on the black violinist. What happened next shocked everyone. A black woman, standing in the Grand Symphony that night, scorned most by her own conductor, would soon force him into the deepest regret of his life. Aurora Hall, New York. A palace of chandeliers and velvet seats, where classical music was guarded like a fortress of privilege. On that night, the audience dressed in black tie and pearls, faces hardened, eyes sharpened, ready to remind anyone who did not fit their world that this stage was not theirs. And then she appeared, Mira Johnson, a black woman with a violin pressed to her chest, carrying the weight of every cruel whisper, every mocking glance, every locked door her people had faced for generations. To them, she was not an artist, she was an intruder. But what unfolded shattered arrogance and silenced prejudice. One performance turned contempt into tears, bigotry into shame, and a hall of skeptics into witnesses of truth. This is not just music. This is a reckoning. This is the night America remembered. Talent has no color, and silence is no longer an option. Under the radiant chandeliers of Aurora Hall, New York's pride in classical grandeur, the night seemed drenched in perfection. The marble floors gleamed, every seat was filled with the city's cultural elite, and the air pulsed with anticipation. This was not just a concert, it was a declaration of status. Men in tuxedos adjusted their cufflinks. Women in sequin gowns whispered with the certainty that they belonged. They had come not simply to hear music, but to reaffirm an old belief, that the language of the great European masters was theirs alone, safeguarded within these gilded walls. At the center of this spectacle was Elias Morgan, the maestro whose baton ruled Aurora Hall with iron precision. At 48, his reputation was legend, his arrogance well-earned. He was hailed as a genius, yet feared as a tyrant. Musicians under his command spoke of his cruelty, of the way he shattered young talents with a glare or expelled them with a single word. To the audience, though, Elias embodied refinement. He was the guardian of an art form they imagined untarnished, untouched by the grit and color of the city beyond. But beneath the polished facade, another truth lived in Aurora Hall, a truth that many refused to confront. For decades, people of color had been told in whispers and in open sneers that certain instruments were not theirs to play. The violin, especially, had been called an instrument of nobility, as if wood and strings could recognize bloodlines. Black children who picked it up were often mocked, told to put it down and return to drums, or to voices in church choirs, as though their place in music had already been decided for them. The very architecture of Aurora Hall echoed this prejudice. Built on donations from old money families who prided themselves on preserving tradition, its walls had rarely seen a musician who did not fit the narrow mold of whiteness and wealth. On this night, when Mira Johnson took her place among the second violins, the atmosphere shifted. At 42, her presence was a quiet rebellion. Her skin, her history, her very existence on that stage unsettled some in the audience. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Who is she? A violinist? Impossible. Some whispered more cruelly, questioning why the orchestra had stooped so low, allowing a black woman from Brooklyn to sit among them. To many, her presence felt like an intrusion, a reminder that the world outside Aurora's doors was changing, and they resented it. The phony elegance of the evening could not disguise the hostility in those glances. Mira had lived with this all her life, the stares that dismissed her, the words that stung sharper than any wrong note. Years ago, when she won an international competition in Vienna, critics celebrated her as a prodigy, but some in her own country sneered that it was a token victory, as if her triumph had been charity rather than brilliance. Fame became a burden, her family fractured under the pressure, and she walked away from the stage, choosing silence over survival. Now, as Elias raised his baton, the unspoken conflict in the room was undeniable. This was not merely a concert. It was a battleground of perception. The chandeliers glowed, but the air was heavy with prejudice, an ancient voice muttering that music of this kind was never meant for hands like hers. Yet among the contempt, a different current flowed, the possibility that in one performance Mira could upend centuries of exclusion. Tonight was no ordinary evening in Aurora Hall. Tonight, The polished order of privilege would be tested by the raw, undeniable truth of a woman who carried not only her violin, but the weight of a people who had been told too often they did not belong. When Mira Johnson walked onto the stage of Aurora Hall, the air in the hall shifted with a violence that no violin string could soften. She did not stumble. She did not bow her head. She carried herself with a quiet, unyielding dignity, the kind born not of privilege, but of survival. Yet the crowd, draped in silks and polished jewels, did not see dignity. They saw an offense. Their faces tightened. Their whispers hissed through the chandeliers like snakes in the rafters. Who allowed her in? A man in the orchestra seats demanded, his voice dripping with disgust. His companion adjusted her pearls and smirked. This hall was not built for that. Others followed in chorus. A violin for them? Absurd. Next they'll be putting them on the podium. Laughter rose, sharp and cruel, not hidden but flaunted, as if her presence were a circus act put on to amuse them. From the balcony, a woman leaned forward, her fan hiding her mouth, but not her venom. I came here to hear Mozart, not charity. Beside her, a man in a black suit muttered, This orchestra used to stand for standards. Now it's a political display. Every row, every corner of the hall seemed to pulse with the same resentment. To them, Mira's very skin was a disruption, a trespass into a sanctuary they had long claimed as their own. On stage, the other musicians were no kinder. A violinist beside her slid his chair an inch away, the scrape of wood on marble loud in the silence. Watch her, he whispered to the flutist across the row. She'll crack the first bar. The cellist to her left snorted, shaking his head. She's here because of pity, that's all. Even the stagehands froze near the curtain, staring as though waiting for the inevitable humiliation. Mira heard every word. She had been hearing versions of these words since she was a child in Brooklyn, when teachers told her the violin was too refined for hands like hers. She had heard it after Vienna, when she became the first Black American woman to take the gold in an international competition, and her own country dismissed her victory as a gimmick. She had heard it when critics sneered that her playing was too raw, too soulful, never the pristine, sterile perfection they demanded. And she had paid the price for daring to rise. Fame had shattered her home, stolen her peace, driven her into silence. Now, returning after years of absence, she had chosen anonymity, hoping to play without notice. But Aurora Hall, this shrine of exclusion, refused to let her pass unseen. Every whisper, every glare, every cruel smile pressed against her like a wall of knives. The contempt was so palpable it seemed to thicken the air, suffocating the music before it began. In their eyes, she was not a violinist, not an artist, not a woman of flesh and blood. She was a trespasser, a provocation, a symbol to be crushed. Yet she did not bow, she did not flinch. Her fingers rested lightly on the polished wood of her violin, steady, patient, like the hand of a soldier waiting for the signal to strike. The hall was ready for her collapse. They craved it, demanded it, needed her failure to confirm what they had always believed. But beneath their sneers and poisoned whispers, something else stirred a silent, dangerous anticipation. Because if Mira did not break, if she dared to rise above the hate and unleash her truth, Aurora Hall itself would never be the same. Mira Johnson had once been the pride of her neighborhood, the girl who carried a battered violin case through the cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn while neighbors shook their heads, whispering, That instrument isn't for us. They told her mother not to waste money on lessons, that a black girl would never stand beneath the chandeliers of the great concert halls. But her mother believed. She worked double shifts at the hospital, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, just to pay for lessons. Mira practiced until her fingers blistered, until her bow cut grooves into the strings. She carried not only her own dreams, but the weight of a family's hope that maybe, just maybe, someone from their block could break through the glass wall. When she won in Vienna, the world applauded, but America turned its face away. In Europe, critics called her transcendent. Back home, the headlines were laced with poison. A diversity darling, one paper scoffed, reducing her to a symbol instead of an artist. On television, commentators debated whether her victory was real or staged for politics. Some even said the judges had been charmed by the novelty of her skin, not the mastery of her hand. Imagine giving your life to an instrument, spilling your blood into every note, only to have your brilliance dismissed as charity. The backlash did not stop at her. Cameras stalked her family. Her younger brother, proud at first, was spit on outside school. Your sister's only famous because she's black, classmates sneered, their cruelty echoing what adults said in private. Her mother, who had sacrificed everything, opened the paper to find her daughter's picture beneath headlines that questioned her worth. Even at home, in the sanctuary of her living room, Mira could not escape. Reporters pressed against the windows, their flashbulbs intruding on dinners, on arguments, on tears. Her marriage collapsed under the glare, her partner unable to withstand the constant pressure of being married to a woman treated as both hero and fraud. 3 years after Vienna, the same girl who once made audiences weep with joy walked away in silence. She put her violin back in its case, closed the latch, and let the dust gather. To the world, she was a prodigy who had broken under pressure. To her, she was a woman drowning under the weight of a country that could not bear to see her succeed. She chose her family, what little of it remained whole, over the spotlight that had consumed them. She chose to disappear rather than watch her gift twisted into a spectacle for others to mock. But music does not leave so easily. In quiet moments, when the city slept, she would still hear the notes pressing against her chest, like a heartbeat refusing to die. Tonight, sitting in Aurora Hall, every cruel word and every stolen joy returned. And to anyone in the audience who had ever been told they were not enough because of their skin, their gender, their roots, her silence, her pain, her exile felt personal. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every soul who had ever carried brilliance inside them, only to be told the world had no place for it. And tonight, they waited with her, aching for the moment she would finally play again. Aurora's rehearsal hall shimmered with chandeliers, yet beneath that golden light lurked a cruelty no ornament could hide. Elias Morgan stood at the podium, his tuxedo pressed to perfection, every button gleaming like medals of superiority he had never earned. His jaw was sharp, clenched tight, and his lips curled into that familiar smirk, one that never smiled, only sneered. The musicians knew it well. It was the smirk of a man who found joy not in music, but in breaking those who dared to challenge him. He scanned the orchestra with eyes as cold as steel, pausing at Mira Johnson. A deliberate pause. His gaze was not neutral. It was dripping with contempt, the way one might look at an insect crawling across a velvet carpet. He tapped the stand with his baton, slow, deliberate, every strike echoing through the room like a judge's gavel. "Johnson," he finally said, his voice sharp, cutting, laced with venom that slithered into every corner of the hall. "You will play, now, the Tchaikovsky Concerto, first movement, cadenza." It was not a request. It was an ambush. His eyes narrowed, savoring the discomfort that swept across the musicians. Some looked away, ashamed. Others leaned forward, eager to witness the downfall. Elias thrived on this spectacle, the cruelty staged as entertainment. His thin smile widened, exposing teeth clenched with arrogance. He wanted her to fail, not because the music demanded it, but because her skin told him she did not belong. As Mira rose, he tilted his head, a mockery of curiosity. "Let's see if talent truly runs beyond the boundaries of breeding," he whispered, just loud enough for the front row to hear. The words carried weight, soaked in centuries of prejudice. A second violinist flinched at the cruelty, but Elias's stare froze him silent. His body language betrayed his delight. He leaned back slightly, baton dangling like a predator's claw, his fingers tapping the podium in rhythm with her supposed collapse. Every movement screamed superiority, as though the stage itself bent under his will. The lines around his eyes deepened not from laughter, but from years of sneers and disdain. He was a man who believed control was his birthright, and humiliation his chosen art. When Mira lifted her bow, Elias's eyes gleamed with anticipation. He imagined the screech of a missed note, the stumble of her hands, the visible cracking of her composure. He could already hear the whispers. She was never meant for this stage. His smirk spread into something darker, an expression that revealed not just arrogance, but malice. Yet beneath that cruel facade, a flicker of unease stirred when the first note rang out, not broken but brilliant. Still, he forced the sneer to stay, gripping the baton tighter, as though by sheer will he could bend her music to his prejudice. But with every soaring phrase, every flawless run, his mask slipped further. And for the first time, the orchestra saw Elias not as the great conductor of New York, but as he truly was, a bitter man, small in spirit, desperate to preserve a crumbling illusion of power by stepping on the brilliance of others. The evening of the performance arrived, and Aurora Hall pulsed with a tension that felt almost physical. The chandeliers glimmered like frozen constellations, but beneath their beauty, the air carried the weight of centuries, centuries of doors closed in the faces of people who looked like Mira. Elias Morgan, the celebrated maestro, stood tall at the podium, his tuxedo sharp, his chin lifted in that familiar angle of superiority. To the audience, he was a figure of power, tradition, refinement. But behind the polished facade lingered a man who believed classical music was the last untouchable fortress of whiteness. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept across the orchestra until they landed on Mira. For a brief second, the mask slipped. What remained was not genius or grace, but venom, a twisted satisfaction at the thought of seeing her stumble. Mira, dressed in a simple gown that seemed almost modest compared to the opulence around her, lifted her violin. She felt the familiar knot in her chest, the memories of being laughed at in conservatories, of hearing slurs whispered like poison in hallways, of the heavy silence that greeted her achievements, as if brilliance was a mistake when it came from her skin. Elias had chosen the concerto not to showcase her talent, but to expose her, to remind her and everyone watching that in his mind she did not belong. He raised his baton with deliberate cruelty, savoring the moment like a hangman savoring the silence before the rope is pulled. The first note Mira played cut through the hall like a blade, trembling at first, fragile, almost human in its vulnerability. A smirk touched Elias's lips. But then the second note came, and the third, and with them poured something raw and undeniable. The tremble steadied, her bow carved through the strings with precision born not of privilege but of survival. Every measure told a story Elias could never silence, the story of her ancestors, of ships crossing oceans in chains, of fields worked until hands bled, of voices raised in songs of sorrow and hope. Each note was both wound and triumph, carrying the echoes of those who had been denied a stage, a voice, a chance. The audience leaned forward. Some clutched their chests. Others wiped at eyes they did not expect to water. They came to hear music, but what they heard was truth. Elias's smile faltered. His grip on the baton tightened until his knuckles turned pale. He tried to hold control, to dictate the tempo, but Mira no longer followed his gestures. She was beyond him now, beyond his rules and prejudice. She was leading, and the orchestra, almost unconsciously, followed her. For the first time in his career, Elias Morgan was rendered powerless in his own kingdom. When the last note hung in the air, it was not silence that followed, it was thunder. Applause erupted, wave after wave, as people rose to their feet. Mira lowered her violin, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wet but unbroken. Elias turned to face the ovation, but it was not for him. His polished smile could not mask the truth. The hall had chosen, and it had chosen her. The ovation thundered across Aurora Hall, rising and falling like waves crashing against the marble walls. For years, the orchestra had mirrored Elias Morgan's disdain, their glances at Mira sharpened by prejudice, their silence weighted with judgment. But now, as her final note still hung in the air, something in the room shifted. What had once been contempt cracked open into awe, disbelief bending into reluctant admiration. The violinists who had smirked during rehearsals now stared at Mira with wide eyes, their bows still trembling above the strings. The cellists, who once whispered about her place on stage, sat motionless, as if struck dumb by the sound they had just witnessed. Even the brass section, men hardened by years of Elias's rule, exchanged looks that carried more than surprise, they carried respect. The sneers that had lived in their eyes dissolved, replaced by a recognition they could not deny. It was as though Mira's bow had sliced through centuries of arrogance and laid bare the truth. Talent knows no color. Elias, meanwhile, stood like a statue at the podium, his baton slack in his hand. He had believed Mira's failure would reinforce the unspoken hierarchy that had always governed Aurora Hall. Instead, her triumph exposed the smallness of his world. He wore the expression of a man betrayed not by others, but by the very lie he had built his empire upon. His face, tight with rage, was illuminated by the same spotlight that cast Mira in radiance. Charles, a veteran trumpeter, could not stay silent. Leaning forward, his voice low but charged with pride, he whispered, "You've reminded us of something we forgot. We belong here, too." "Thank you, Mira." His words carried across the brass section, and a few nodded in quiet agreement. These were men who had learned to bury their truth beneath professionalism, but tonight, Mira had unearthed it for them. In the second row of violins, a young woman, barely 28, clutched her instrument, her chest heaving. She remembered the smirk she had given Mira earlier, the quick judgments, the echoes of Elias's prejudice she had adopted without question. Now her throat tightened with shame and admiration. Tears blurred her sight as she whispered inwardly, "She stood against all of us and won." For the first time, she wanted to learn, not compete. The audience caught the shift in the orchestra's air. They could sense it in the way the musicians' postures softened, the way eyes once narrowed in derision now followed Mira with reverence. This was no longer just a performance, it was a reckoning. The hall seemed to breathe with new life, as though its grand chandeliers had witnessed a wound begin to heal. Mira did not bow right away. She stood tall, violin at her side, her chest rising and falling with quiet strength. The applause roared not just from the audience, but seemed to vibrate within the orchestra itself, the very musicians who had once doubted her now unwilling to look away. Respect had taken root where scorn had lived. For one night, Aurora Hall no longer belonged to Elias Morgan. It belonged to Mira. The hall was still trembling with the echo of Mira's last note, when a sound broke the silence, not applause, not whispers, but the sharp crack of a violin bow falling to the floor. All eyes turned, not to Mira, but to the young violinist in the front row, her face contorted as if some private storm had burst inside her. She was only 28, a prodigy raised in the soft cradle of privilege, her path smoothed by money, mentors, and a last name that opened doors before she ever knocked. Minutes earlier, she had been one of the many who smirked, who whispered, who measured Mira not by the music in her soul, but by the shade of her skin. She remembered every cruel glance, every dismissive thought, every ounce of arrogance she had carried like armor. And now, that armor was shattering. Her shoulders shook, tears welled, slid hot down her cheeks, and splashed against the polished wood of her violin. She tried to hold them back, but the shame was too heavy, the guilt too sharp. Her breath came in broken sobs as the words escaped her lips, fragile, trembling. "God forgive me, I was blind." The orchestra froze. Some musicians turned away, ashamed of their own complicity. Others stared, wide-eyed, as if seeing for the first time the ugliness of their silence, their laughter, their complicity with Elias's cruelty. The audience leaned forward, caught in the gravity of the moment. This was no longer a concert, it was a reckoning. The young violinist raised her eyes to Mira, and in that single glance, everything unraveled. Mira did not look at her with vengeance. There was no triumph in her gaze, no hunger to humiliate. Instead, there was a stillness, a quiet dignity so profound it stripped away every mask of superiority in the room. That look said, "I have endured more than your scorn. I play not for your approval, but for truth itself." The young woman broke completely. She saw not only Mira's strength, but her own weakness, her own cowardice. And in her sobbing admiration, there bloomed something new devotion, a longing to learn, to change, to be worthy of even a fragment of Mira's courage. The silence in Aurora Hall deepened. No one dared to cough, to shift, to break the spell. What they witnessed was larger than music. It was the unmasking of prejudice, the tearing down of walls built by generations of arrogance. It was the birth of a disciple at the feet of a master who had carried her truth through fire. And so, in that sacred hush, the hall became a church, the music a sermon, and Mira, the preacher who spoke without words. Every heart beat harder, every soul leaned closer. None dared miss a syllable of this unfolding confession because they knew. They were not just watching a young woman repent, they were watching themselves. The last notes of Mira's violin still hung in the air like a prayer unanswered, and for a moment Aurora Hall was paralyzed. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence cracked, not with shame alone, but with something rising, something fierce, something long denied. Among the audience, the older generation sat stricken, their faces carved with lines of history. They remembered their silence, yes. They remembered the years when fear chained their voices and prejudice poisoned their neighborhoods. Tears fell freely, but now the tears did not only sting with regret, they glistened with release, with the breaking of a dam that had held too long. And then, from within the orchestra, a sound not of music but of voice rang out. It was the trumpet player, his skin dark as the Mississippi earth, his hair silvered by time, his eyes carrying half a century of storms. He rose, tall and unshaken, and when he spoke, his voice filled every corner of the hall. "We shine," he said, his tone rich and unyielding. "We shine even when they try to bury us. We shine even when they laugh, when they chain, when they silence. We shine because the blood of survival runs through us, because the rhythm of freedom beats in our chest." Every word struck like a drum, steady and unstoppable. "I used to play this trumpet just to endure, just to scrape by. But tonight, Mira, tonight you showed me that we are not beggars of music, not imitators in someone else's hall. We are creators. We are conquerors. And when you played, you proved that our voices will never again be hidden in the shadows of their chandeliers. We are the light, we are the thunder, and we are here to stay." His words rolled like thunder across the marble and velvet. In the crowd, black elders wept openly, but this time their tears gleamed with pride. They had waited lifetimes for a moment like this, when their pain was not just pitied but transformed into power. White-haired men who once bowed their heads now lifted them, clapping through tears, acknowledging that what they had ignored could no longer be denied. Then it came a surge of applause that shattered the hall. Not polite clapping, not hesitant hands, but a roar, a standing ovation so fierce the chandeliers trembled above. The sound was defiance, joy, vindication. It was a hymn of justice echoing through Aurora Hall, a space that once symbolized exclusion, now baptized in the fire of truth. Mira bowed her head humbly, but her eyes glistened. She knew this was more than her triumph. This was a triumph for every voice silenced, every dream deferred, every child told they did not belong. Tonight, they all belonged. Tonight, they were not only heard, they were celebrated. And in that standing ovation, in that thunder of hands and hearts, every black soul in the room felt it deep in their bones. The tide had turned. The thunder of applause rolled through Aurora Hall like a tidal wave, refusing to fade, refusing to yield. It was not polite clapping. It was a roar, raw and relentless, that shook the chandeliers and seemed to press against every pane of glass. Yet amid the ovation, one figure stood frozen, his baton limp at his side, his face pale as marble. Elias Morgan. For years, Elias had ruled this stage with an iron fist and an unshakable creed that true artistry belonged only to the white, the privileged, the chosen. He had sharpened this belief into a weapon, cutting down any who dared to challenge him. And tonight, he had set his sights on Mira Johnson, certain she would falter, certain her skin, her history, her very existence would betray her. But she had not faltered. She had soared. Her solo had risen above every sneer, every doubt, every wall erected against her. It had wrapped around the hall like a flame, consuming prejudice, igniting awe. And now, with the audience refusing to stop their thunderous applause, Elias stood exposed. His silence was no longer power, it was cowardice. All eyes turned toward him. The musicians shifted in their seats, waiting. The young violinist still had tears on her cheeks. The trumpet player stared, unblinking, daring him to deny what every ear had heard, what every heart had felt. The audience leaned forward, breathless, their demand clear. Say it, admit it, no more lies. Elias's jaw tightened. His fingers trembled. For a man who had built a life on control, the moment was torture. But there was no escape. The applause grew louder, pounding like a drumbeat of judgment. Finally, with his voice cracking under the weight of humiliation and truth, he spoke. Mira Johnson. His throat constricted, but he forced the words out. Delivered the finest solo I have ever witnessed in this hall. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by an explosion of cheers, shouts, sobs. The words echoed like a verdict, tearing down the fortress of arrogance Elias had built. Mira did not bow. She did not gloat. She simply stood, her violin in hand, her posture regal, her silence louder than any triumphal cry. For the first time, Elias looked small. Stripped of his grandeur, stripped of his supremacy, he was just a man forced to kneel before a truth he could no longer deny. And the hall, this hallowed ground of exclusion, belonged at last to her. In that moment, the applause was no longer for a performance. It was for history rewritten, for a barrier broken, for justice long delayed but undeniable. Every clap was a hammer, breaking chains, every cheer a cry of liberation. Mira Johnson was no longer a guest in their world. She had claimed it, and in doing so had transformed Aurora Hall forever. Mira did not stand on that stage to reclaim an old crown, nor to chase the fleeting shine of fame. She did not bow with the pride of victory or demand the applause that thundered around her. Instead, she let a quiet smile break across her face, a smile that held more power than any accolade. It was the smile of a woman who knew she had turned pain into beauty, prejudice into melody, silence into voice. She lifted her violin one final time, not for herself but for them, for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong, for every child who had been forced to shrink themselves to fit into a world too small to hold their light. Her bow traced across the strings, releasing a tone so pure it felt like forgiveness. It was not forgiveness for Elias or the cruelty of those who doubted her, but for a society still learning to see itself clearly. The notes rose, fragile yet unbreakable, carrying a truth that could no longer be denied. Music does not bow to color, class, or creed. It belongs to everyone. In its rhythm and harmony, it speaks the language of the soul, a tongue older than prejudice and stronger than hate. Each note was a bridge, stretching across divides of race and wealth, uniting strangers in a shared breath. In the hall, people felt it. The older audience members clutched their chests, remembering the days they had stood silent while others were excluded, their eyes wet with regret and release. The younger ones, wide-eyed, felt hope carve new paths inside their hearts. Musicians on stage lowered their instruments, not in defeat but in reverence, realizing that tonight was larger than art, larger than rivalry. It was about the dignity of humanity itself. Mira's melody lingered in the rafters, threading itself into the crystal chandeliers and carved wood of Aurora Hall, refusing to be contained by walls. It spilled out into the New York night, where people walking the avenues stopped to look upward as though drawn by something unseen. They could not hear the notes, yet somehow they felt them, like a whisper in their bone. When the last vibration stilled, the silence was not emptiness, but a heartbeat steady, eternal. Mira lowered her violin, her eyes shimmering with a peace that no judge, no title, no conductor could ever bestow. She had proven what needed proving, that true artistry is not a weapon of class or race, but a gift of humanity. That night, the hall became more than a place of performance. It became a sanctuary, a witness to the truth that talent, when fused with compassion, transcends every barrier. And as the audience filed out, many carried more than the memory of a concert. They carried a vow that never again would they measure a soul by its skin. Mira Johnson walked off stage not as a performer chasing glory, but as a messenger. Her music had spoken, and its echo would never fade. What stays after this story is not just the sound of a violin, but the reminder that every one of us has once looked too quickly, judged too harshly, or carried a glance that did not see the whole truth. Mira's journey shows us that talent, dignity, and humanity cannot be measured by color, class, or the narrow standards of prejudice. The lesson is clear. When we choose to pause, to listen, and to open our hearts, the world becomes larger, richer, and far more beautiful. If this story touched you, We invite you to share it so others may carry the same reminder. Tell us in the comments how it spoke to your own life. We read every word, and your voice matters here. And if you believe in the power of stories to change hearts, please subscribe to our channel and stay close. Every week, we bring you new lessons drawn from courage, history, and the unshakable spirit of human resilience. Thank you for watching. We wish you health, clarity, and hope. Let the music of compassion guide you, and join us again for the next story that just might change the way you see the world.